You are listening to the Hiking Radio Network, where we talk the walk with shows by hikers, about hikers, for everybody.
Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. Join Steve and his guests every week as he staggers from Georgia to Maine.
Hi guys, and it is lovely that you've chosen to come back and support the show. I am constantly surprised how many people listen every week. This is Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis, and I, for my sins, am Mighty Blue, a two-time Appalachian Trail thru-hiker in my 60s, a time in my life when you think I should have known better. As most of you know, we have guests on the show who have also done the AT in part or in all, as well as other long-distance trails. This week's episode is a little bit different to our usual stuff, with a book theme running right through it. Both of our guests have completed the trail and both have written books. If you stick around and listen closely, you'll hear that we have a giveaway later in the show, so pay attention. Our first guest today, Sarah Jones-Decker, or Harvest, hiked the trail in 2008, but it was her multi-day section hikes a couple of years ago that most interested me. Sarah is a photographer and chose a project that, frankly, I'd never even considered would be a thing. But she produced a beautiful book about the shelters on the AT with all sorts of details and stunning pictures of shelters. Believe me, when you see this book, especially if you've ever camped at one of these shelters, you will be immediately taken back there. It's really fascinating. Sarah will be along in a moment. Bruce Matson, who hiked in 2018, did a podcast with me, returning to Katahdin. In it, we detailed Bruce's, let's say, intense preparation and his hike, with weekly reports that tell a great story of a thru-hike from beginning to end. Well, Bruce has just published a memoir of his hike called Returning to Katahdin, and we chat about that and the other two books that he's written since he's been back. Bruce is on after Sarah. Finally, of course, we hear our Grandma Gatewood coped with the hurricane that was barreling toward her last week. So let's get on with it. Here's Sarah Jones-Decker, or Harvest. So let's meet Sarah Jones-Decker. Sarah's written a book on, of all subjects, shelters on the Appalachian Trail. Hi Sarah, how are you?
Good.
Well, the second question, of course, is what on earth made you do that?
Because I'm a documentary photographer at heart, and we love to see projects that haven't been done and how to go out and do them. And surprisingly, it was not a project that had been done before.
You know what? It doesn't surprise me, but as soon as I heard about it, and you sent me a great PDF version of the book, and it looks fantastic.
Thank you.
And I wondered why it hadn't been done before. So I'm really glad you did it. And we're going to be talking about the book a little bit later. But this show is really about hikers, and I wanted to introduce you as a hiker to our listeners. You had a wonderful grounding on the AT, didn't you? And I believe it was your grandfather who turned you on to the trail. Tell us a little bit more about him, because he's quite the guy, isn't he?
He is. He always says that he's a combination of Peter Pan and Indiana Jones. So that's who we grew up with.
Winning combination.
Yes. He's a world traveler. He's been all over the world. I think he's been, all 50 states, all 7 continents. And he just has a love of travel. And he got my dad into hiking and then eventually me into hiking. And I grew up near the AT in Virginia, right near Bear's Den, for anybody who knows the AT.
Cool, Sam.
But I really got into hiking when I did the White Mountains with my grandfather. I was in high school. I was 16 and he was 71 the first time we went up there.
So what did he see in you as a potential hiker, or did he hike with all his grandchildren?
I was the first grandkid to hike with him, actually. I was also the runner in the family. So my grandfather actually ran road races till he was 76 years old.
Gee.
And he kept, he'd come home with these medals, and I'm like, Grandpa, no one your age runs, of course you win. But yeah, I'm a lot like my dad, and my dad is a lot like my grandpa. So it's kind of this lineage that, where the three of us are just really connected in our outdoor activities.
That's lovely. And in fact, I do know the answer to this, because before we started recording, I did ask you this. He's still around, isn't he?
He is. He is 90 years old, and he still lives on Cape Cod with my grandma, who's 92 years old. Wow. And they are weathering the virus storm together at home.
Oh, gosh, that's lovely, though.
Yeah.
Now, your first experience of a shelter on the trail was the Lake of the Clouds hut. That's not like some of the others, is it?
It is nothing like other shelters on the AT. It sleeps 90 people at capacity, where most shelters sleep 6 to 8 people, and usually you don't have breakfast cooked for you there.
That's right.
Yeah. But that was my first overnight experience on the AT, was up there, and we hiked there in beautiful August weather, and we left in a snowstorm.
All right.
So, Mount Washington.
easily done, of course, isn't it? Yeah. So where do the huts fit into the story of the Appalachian Trail shelter system? Or are they an independent part of the story?
That's a great question. So it almost has to be considered the predecessor of the shelters in a way. I mean,
Sure.
You think about the AT wasn't technically finished until the 30s. The huts were up there in the 1800s. Mount Madison, I think, was 1888 was the first shelter that was up there, hut, I should say. And the hut system predates the completion of the AT, as does Adirondack shelters in New York and the shelters along the Long Trail. So when they started saying, we have this complete chain of shelters, they really had to link into the shelters that were already in existence in order to make this kind of shelter chain start, really. So the huts are in my book as AT shelters because you pass them along the way, but they could be seen as absolutely their own thing, but also kind of the inspiration of a lot of the shelters on the AT.
They definitely do feel like their own thing, though, don't they? Because I don't think as an AT hiker you feel desperately welcome when you go there.
It's a different experience, yeah.
It is, and yet you know what? I'm saying that just because I want to not so much reverse it, but I know that when I went in 2014, I definitely felt that. I felt it so much less this time. And I've got to say, I think the reason is there are more women at the huts now than there used to be, and they're so much more welcoming than they were in 2014.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't know what it feels like to be welcomed at the huts because I was a little behind on my thru-hike in 2008. And when I did the whites on my thru-hike, they were all closed.
Oh, were they?
Oh, yeah. When you go through in September, they're all closed. So
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, they shut down for the season, different dates, but yeah, they shut down. And so we stayed in the dungeon. We camped at Madison. We did get to do We got to do trade at Zealand Falls. That was the only one. And we slept under a table. Wow. After we cleaned their kitchen.
And you actually met your first, as I recall from reading some notes, that you actually met your first thru-hiker, a guy called Lorax, which is a great name. For some reason, meeting Lorax got you sort of hooked on the idea of a thru-hike. What was it about him or how he talked about it that really kind of hooked you and put a thru-hike into your future?
Yeah, it's a cool story, and it's cool in that it has an ending. It's a complete story in that I found this guy on Facebook and I sent him a copy of the book as a surprise. And we've been messaging each other back and forth, Nice. So I was 16. He was probably in his mid-20s, maybe late 20s. And he was, this tall, towering guy. And he was super nice. And we ended up having, sitting around and hanging out with him and talking to him. And the connection is that when he finished, he sent me his Katahdin photo. And it was the first, thing I'd ever gotten like that. And to me, I just thought he was just a really nice guy. And reconnecting with him on Facebook, he's still a kindergarten teacher almost 20 years later. I mean, a 6-foot-something kindergarten teacher. So he just was a nice guy.
But that gave you the push that you wanted, because it was still some years later before you actually went on the thru, because I think you went, is it 2008 you did your thru-hike, didn't you?
I did, yeah. Well, I had to finish high school, and then I finished college. Yeah. So then I finished college, and then I went on to grad school. So I did the trail after grad school, about 10 years after I met him. It was just something I always had in the back of my mind, which I think is true for everyone who has been on a thru-hike. It starts small, and then it just builds until you just have to do it.
It takes over you, doesn't it?
Does, yes.
You got to do it. Yeah,
you have to do it.
You really have. When you went in 2008, and when I read the year you went, were there that many women on the trail at the time? Because I know it's only 12 years ago, but I noticed a big uptick in the number of women hiking in 2019 compared to 2014. So I'd imagine the difference was even starker back in 2008, wasn't it? Yeah,
2008, I don't want to sound like back in my day, but it was really different in that there was no cell phones.
That's right.
Nobody had a cell phone. I didn't even bring one. I used payphones.
Wasn't iPhone out in 2007, 2008?
Nobody had one. Wow. There was no service. There is that, of course, yeah. So That's in that way it was really different. And I feel in that way that there wasn't, in terms of technology, all these Facebook groups and all these meetups and all these options. I think a lot of people went out there on their own versus it was harder to meet up with people before, I think. Like I didn't really meet people until I went out there because there wasn't that much interconnectivity, on Facebook and all these groups and podcasts and, all these things going on. I would say, to answer your question directly, not a lot of women. No. I mean, I bet I met 25 women on my whole thru hike. Wow. Maybe. Yeah. My hiking partner was a girl. Right. But we hiked with 3 guys from pretty much the Shenandoahs to Connecticut. We hiked with a brother-sister group. We always were just hiking with groups of guys.
That's a good thing, though, isn't it?
It's awesome.
It's not cover for you, but I think people have to be careful out there. I think that there's so much more egalitarianism out there now anyway than there was even in 2014. And I think women last year were 40% of the hikers, which is
awesome.
I agree. It's entirely awesome. I totally agree. And I'd also think that the rest of the AT, when compared to the whites, was pretty much a pleasant surprise to you, wasn't it? Because the whites are not the easiest place to hike, are they?
Yeah, well, I did hike a lot in high school because I grew up right near the AT in Virginia. And then I went to Virginia Tech, which is right near the AT. So I had hiked a lot of Virginia, but that was it. I always tell people I was a hiker before I thru-hiked. I was not a backpacker. And I thought I was ready, as we all do. I hiked 7 miles 3 days in a row. And on the 4th day, I hiked 11 miles and I cried in my tent and I didn't eat dinner, So, and then by the time you get to Virginia, you're just racking up 20s, I became a backpacker out there. I started as a hiker.
What do you think it is? For me, I think it's like you get into a rhythm of a hike, don't you? You get this thing of waking up and eating and packing up and eating and walking and you get
eating.
That rhythm.
Lots of eating.
Plenty of eating and plenty of water. But, you get into that rhythm of the hike and that suddenly makes it work for you because I know I didn't cry in my tent at all, but I certainly struggled a lot, in those, especially the first couple of 100 miles. But you get into it, don't you?
Yeah, I think you just find your groove and, hiking with the seasons. You're just like, okay, here I am. It's hot. It's this time of the year. And okay, now it's cooling down. I'm in Vermont. I felt like I just hiked with the seasons and, I didn't have a weather app. I never knew what the weather was. So I feel like, you just kind of become, I don't want to sound cheesy, but, you just become one with it out there. You do. It's so, what I mean.
Yes. And
what I'm saying.
And you let the trail come to you, I think. I think people who take on the trail are doomed for failure. They've got to try to just accept what the day gives you every single day, don't they?
Yeah. My hiking partner, shout out to my hiking partner, Scout. We always said, it's nothing but rainbows and sunshine out here on the AT. Woo, nothing but rainbows and sunshine. Every day, all day, great weather, views, endless views. And you do get those, obviously. But there's a lot of days that are very, very challenging.
And she finished as well with you?
She did, yep.
So had one of you, did you talk about this, by the way, when you were out there? Had one of you not been able to carry on, would the other one have gone home, or did you agree to go beforehand that you were going to carry on regardless?
We definitely said we would carry on regardless. It's interesting in that, I don't want to throw her under the bus here, but...
but you're about to. Excellent.
But I am, because
she knows.
She knows. She met a guy 3 weeks in and left me. For him, because I didn't really care for him. That's a story for another bottle of wine.
That's hilarious.
I didn't really care for him, so they hiked together. My hiking partner and I were sharing a tent, so therefore I was homeless. Great place to be homeless on the AT. And so they kind of hiked their hike, and I hiked my hike, and he got hurt randomly at Partnership Shelter. He stepped out of the shelter, and his muscle popped. Like I heard it. Ooh, somebody almost threw up. Like someone almost legit threw up because it sounded, anyway, he had to quit. And so I kept hiking, and then she caught a taxi and caught up with me, and we finished together.
and you remain friends?
Yeah. I flew to Hawaii and saw her a couple years ago. Awesome. Yeah, absolutely still friends.
That is awesome. I didn't know that at all. It's terrific. Yeah.
And then she got off another time for a beach trip that turned into a family emergency, and I hiked, I think, 400 miles without her.
Wow.
In Pennsylvania, yeah. So
you were clearly, for some strange reason, attracted to shelters. But what was it about the AT that really did it for you? Did it obviously lived up to your expectations? How did it resonate with you as a person?
I think hiking the trail changes you, no matter what trail it is, whether any trail, any long distance trail that you're out there for thousands of miles. I think it it just changes your life in a way that you can do anything because you did that thing.
I agree.
And you finished it because you're stubborn as hell and you did it. And it makes everything else coming your way. It's like, well, I did that. I can do whatever. I don't know. That's the way I feel about it. Just changed. I always knew I could do things, but once you get that confidence, you're like, yeah, but you remember that time you were hiking in the rain and you had hypothermia and it was awful. And, if a helicopter dropped a rope to me on Saddleback in Maine, I would have been out, quit, over it, done. But there was no helicopter, so I finished.
And you had, as I always say, you had few options, so quite right too, yeah. And are you a hiker who prefers to actually stay in the shelters, or do you prefer to camp outside them?
Depends on the time of year. I mean, I stayed in some shelters. I typically like to sleep in my tent for personal reasons, but I support all leave no trace all the time, and I think staying at a shelter can limit impact. And your friends are there, and there's a picnic table there, and there's a bathroom, and there's
that is
people.
the social.
It's social,
there's something wonderful.
Social.
There's something wonderful to me to walk down a little Blue Blaze trail and not knowing who's going to be there and people you may not have met for some time. And I think it's the wonderful part of the trail.
Yeah, it's awesome. But I stayed in a lot of shelters, especially in Maine. Like I said, I finished October 14th, and when Katahdin closes,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So Maine in October. I just kind of didn't feel like setting up my tent. So I stayed in shelters like the last, a lot of Maine.
You mentioned earlier, by the way, and I just want to come back to this because you mentioned you stayed in the dungeon, which is underneath or right at the back, around the back of the Lake of the Clouds, isn't it? And you actually phoned your grandfather from there, didn't you? That must have been a very surreal and very emotional, I imagine, for him, wasn't it?
It was, and especially again, it's 2008, so we had a flip phone. My hiking partner had a flip phone, and we were able to get a call out. I mean, it was an unreal experience in that, Mount Washington has X amount of clear days a year, right? Less than 50, right?
Yeah.
And we saw Mount Washington for 6 days.
Cool.
And we hiked to Mount Washington, and we get there. We stayed, just below it at Lakes of the Clouds, and you could see forever. I mean, we were saying you could see Boston. I don't know what we were looking at, but we could see forever. And my friend was like, let's call your grandpa. And I'm like, all right, let's do it. And we could not believe we got a call through.
Oh, lovely.
It was awesome. And my grandfather is a very sensitive guy. He is a very emotional man. He's been through a lot. And he cried when he read my book. He cried when I called him that night. I mean, he would cry if he was listening to this right now.
He'll be crying. He'll be crying at this then, no doubt as well.
He's so sweet. Yeah.
Well, shout out to Grandpa.
I will. I will. Hi, Grandpa Jones.
Did you go on any other long hikes off the AT, or was that the one long distance hike you could do?
I've done the John Muir Trail.
Oh, right.
And the long trail is on my list next.
Oh, I bet as a photographer, you'd love the John Muir Trail, didn't you?
It was awesome. So good.
I failed to do it twice.
Yeah, I want to do it again. I've talked to my husband about doing it again, but I just want to do it with him and with our daughter. My husband and I have gotten into long distance biking. So that's kind of what we've been doing the last couple of years together. We also do a lot of long distance rafting trips. Like we have rode the Grand Canyon and
wow.
Yeah,
I've done 179 miles in a Grand Canyon in a 6 days and 5 nights in the canyon. Yeah.
Nice. Well, we did 18 and it was it was just me and my husband in a boat. We didn't have a guide. We guided ourselves.
Oh,
with
I
friends.
had a guide. I had a big guide. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, we did it. Just us and
Very
our
cool.
friends went, and they, 2 people per boat, and that's talk about life changing, and talk about the best place to be as a photographer. But
I would think, yeah.
My husband and I try to do a long distance something like we rotate through, so we do biking and hiking and rafting. So every 3 years, I think it is, we do a long bike trip.
How on earth do you get time away? Because I know you're a farmer. So,
yes.
The farms don't run themselves from my memory anyway. So
they don't.
How'd that work out?
We always travel in October and November.
Oh, right. Okay. Makes sense. Yeah, of course. Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the project then.
Yeah, let's do it.
So how did you come to write about, how did you come to think about getting the shelters? Did you think this was something you wanted just to have the photographs, or did you want to have stories about them? What were you looking to achieve with the book?
When I first started thinking about it, it was actually an idea I had back in 2008. It was in my little journal that I kept.
All right.
My hiking partner had just finished her master's in architecture, and I had just finished my master's in photography. So she talked about the shelters all the time when we were out there, and she drew some of them, and she would show me different pylons and roof arch systems. I'm not the architect, obviously, of the group.
Impressive.
But, she showed me a lot of different things. And I just remember thinking that was really interesting. And my idea really stems from kind of my art heroes. I thank my grad school professor in the back of the book for introducing me to them. But there's a German photographer couple named Bernard and Hilla Becker. And which is funny because my name is Sarah Decker, Hilla Becker.
Yeah.
And we share a birthday, which is amazing because she's literally my art hero. And we must think the same as Virgos. But anyway, they are a German duo, both passed, that would photograph crumbling buildings and industrial landscapes in Germany. And they did it in a very German way, like they always did it on the same type of day, overcast lighting. They would take a measuring tape and make sure it was the same distance. And then they would print their work, black and white, beautiful, gorgeous, very German, black and white prints in grids. And so you could compare the subtle differences of these structures because you'd see 20 German factories together or 20 water towers together. And so, people always say all the shelters on the AT are the same. And it's like, man, they really aren't, though, if you compare them all together. So my original idea was just to make a collage poster of the shelters, similar to this AT poster that I have that's like all the AT symbols that I saw when I went on my 08 thru hike. And I thought, okay, I'll just make a poster of the shelters. And that'd be so cool because you could look at them all. And then I thought, is there a book like that? And then it just snowballed into this 2-year project.
Yeah, a 2-year project indeed, because that was one of the most amazing things you said. To go and see, you saw all the shelters on this project?
Almost all of them. So I've had 26 photographer friends either go out and photograph for me, come photograph with me, or photographs that they had from their thru hikes.
Right. Well, there's several amazing things I've got from your book already. One of which was that if you were to visit all the shelters, you would extend your thru hike by something like 68 or 70 miles.
Yeah, it's like 67 miles.
That is extraordinary. So what is the longest distance from the trail to a shelter then?
I believe the longest one is the one in Georgia. I mean, anyone who's listening is probably like, I don't know, I didn't go to it. Because you're in Georgia. You just started. You're exhausted. 1.3 miles downhill.
Oh, gosh.
So on the way up the next morning, it's 1.3 miles uphill for breakfast. Well, that doesn't even count.
So when you did some of those, didn't you? Obviously, you went down to take the pictures and so on. Are we missing out on something? Are some of these Blue Blaze trails quite nice views, or are they just simply just a path into the shelter?
A lot of them are a little bonus hike. That hike actually has a little view.
Nice.
You have to think about someone had to put that shelter there. There's a reason that shelter is there. Yeah. So it's flat. It has a water source. It's protected from the wind typically, or, it's just in a good spot. So it's kind of neat to see someone had to go down there and find that spot to where they could build that thing and have it be there for years.
I remember thinking that, funnily enough, on that very shelter on the trail, thinking, firstly, why did they put that there? And do you know why they put that particular one there?
Honestly, I don't want to be wrong, but it might be one of the ones where, the trail relocated. It used to be a lot closer to the trail. Maybe the trail is down there.
It must
that
be
happens
that, yeah.
a lot.
Yeah. And so when you did this project, you redid the trail in about 200 section hikes.
Yes.
and for quite a bit of that, apparently you carried all of your camera gear and a little 9-month edition, apparently, didn't you?
Yes, my
tell us all about this young hiker.
Oh my gosh, my daughter Josephine. So I started working on this project, and I had, the go ahead. I'd contacted the ATC, and I told my husband I wanted to work on this project, and I was on maternity leave from my job, and I was like, okay, I'm going to start hiking 1 week, 1 day a week. Start kind of ticking off the ones in North Carolina and Tennessee where we live. And my husband is very busy. He's a farmer, and he said, okay, cool. So you taking her with you? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, okay, well then I can't say anything. See ya. I mean, there's nothing he can do about it. So I took her with me every week on Wednesdays. My local friend would meet me and we'd go hiking, another mama friend. And we started, I'd have a break from school. I'm a professor here in North Carolina, and I would have a spring break. So I would go somewhere and do a week-long section. Nice. Or I would, fall break or Thanksgiving break, all these different breaks. And so my daughter did go on a lot of longer trips with me. So she did sections in Georgia, lots of North Carolina and Tennessee, Virginia. She did half of Maryland, half of Pennsylvania, and all of Connecticut and Massachusetts with me.
Wow, that's lovely. What lovely thing! What a lovely thing to share. I'm sure she's in a lot of the pictures, but she's not in the book, is she? You don't
she
put a
is
bit.
twice.
Oh, is she? I didn't say. Oh,
Oh,
I never
yeah.
saw. Oh, right.
Yeah,
That's cool.
she's in there.
That's really cool. So
Yeah.
give us a bit of a potted version of what the shelter system actually is and how they grew up on the trail. Is there something was there a linking thing, or was it just simply done by the clubs for their particular area?
Well, I write a couple pages in the book. I have a shelter history section. I was able to work with this historian named Mills Kelly, and he's a distinguished professor at George Mason University. And we have since become friends. He's come down to my
Nice.
farm 2 times. But he comes down and he says, okay, let's write this history thing. And he's been researching for years, and he got me into the archives in the ATC, which, is an experience in itself. But the idea for the continuous shelter chain was kind of put out there. Some of the early guys involved just saw a lot of value in having a gathering place along the trail. And so early on in the 20s, they were like, we're going to start building shelters. But there wasn't, not like we know of today. I mean, there was less than 100 shelters south of the Whites.
Wow.
Think about that. There wasn't a lot.
Well,
And so,
I want to say that because you got a great little sort of potted fact thing, and one of the things that stuck out to me, the number of official shelters officially recognised by the ATC is 276, which seems extraordinary, an amazing amount to me. The states with the most shelters almost or inevitably would be Virginia, 63. There's 2 shelters that sleep just 4 people. Now, one is McQueen's Knob Shelter, Tennessee. I don't remember that one at all. I remember
that's the little emergency only shelter.
Oh, right. Okay. It says
right before
Damascus.
Damascus.
Right. Oh, right.
Yep.
Oh, okay. That's right. Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Fine.
And then there's one in Pennsylvania. When you're in Pennsylvania and there's the double shelters?
Yes.
Okay. One of them in Pennsylvania was burned to the ground. So he's just there by himself.
Oh, really? When was that?
It's so sad. Yeah.
And for those of you who've been there, you will know the 2 together. One says snorers, one says non-snorers,
Yes.
which I've got to tell you was a lie for people who went into the non-snoring section. and also the other one that really stuck out to me was that the furthest distance between shelters, I almost don't want to say it because I want that to be your quiz question, but no, let's say it. It was, what's the first? It's
32 miles from
32. Yeah. I can't understand how that can be.
Yeah, because there must be just nothing. I mean, if you think about it, it's that western, it's that New York section.
Yeah.
And I think there's just, remember you're like in the New York Deli Challenge?
That's right, yeah.
It's a lot of private property.
There's a Greymore Monastery that of the
Remember that?
Yes, I do, but I don't remember the lack of shelters. But yes,
I know.
there obviously
because you
are.
were doing big miles then. It wasn't a big deal to you.
Trust me. When you're 66, it was all a big deal to you. Trust me. You're going to take my word for that. Yeah. So the shelter system grew up, and I know I actually saw
it was slow.
Yeah, well, I know, but I read a post recently on Facebook where the writer suggested taking down all of the AT shelters, and as you'd imagine, there was a variety of reaction. What do you think the shelter system itself adds to the AT experience for a hiker?
You said someone just recently posted that they should tear them all down?
Yep.
Well, it's funny that they actually were almost all going to be torn down in the 70s.
Oh,
so
right.
that was something that, it was a petition. The ATC put it out there. Hey, do you guys think we should save it? And even then, it was not universal. A lot of people wanted to tear them down. They kind of met in the middle and said, okay, let's tear down the ones that are party sites. Let's tear down the ones that are too close to the road. And there was like kind of this big brushing of shelters where they tore down a lot of shelters all at once, like a big, time period where they tore down a lot of them before they started building a lot of them again. But I think it adds that social aspect. And I know, here we are in the land of COVID and, can't do anything social on the trail. That's kind of the place you get to be social, because otherwise you're just on your path, you're, doing your own thing, and you get to the shelter and you stop for a minute. And I mean, I've met people from all over the world at the shelters, and, maybe you meet them at the shelter. I mean, I have to give a shout out to the Cincinnati boys. I met these 3 guys at the Mount Collins shelter in the Smokies on my thru-hike. And we kind of, hung out that night, cooked together. You become instant friends. We ended up summiting Katahdin together. And
it is the shelter that does that. There's no question. To me,
yes.
there's no question. And
yes.
Your book so resonated with me because all of the pictures I got them on my phone and my iPad, and I was zooming in to see to see them. And I then had to listen to little bits of my podcast when I was a certain place, and they remind me of certain things that happened. They jar your memory so much, don't they? Just by looking at them sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I look back through my photos from 2008 and I wish I would have taken more shelter photos than I did.
I bet,
I mean,
yes.
the
Yeah.
technology was a lot different back then. Of course, I just had a little, point and shoot waterproof camera, but
Yeah.
I used a lot of pictures from my 2008 hike, but I would look at these shelters and I go, oh my God, that day was awful. It was pouring rain, my foot hurt, whatever. And then I go back to it as a new, a section hiker, and I have new experiences from it,
Yeah.
And one thing with my book is it's not about my hike. It's really
No, I know.
this could be anybody's hike, and I thought about, oh, I could write a whole book on crazy shelter stories. And it's like, no, instead I made a book where people could go and tell their own stories to themselves or to their friends that weren't there.
Definitely.
It's like a walk down memory lane, but it's a choose your own adventure.
And you include
situation.
other photos as well. I mean, there's a couple of really lovely photos out there as well.
Thank you.
And there are some real beautiful shelters, aren't there? Do you think that some of this is a matter of local pride between clubs? Because I don't remember, I forgot the name, but you probably know the name. You come out of, I think, Caledonia State Park, and you go up this hill, this mountain, and at the top there, just as you turn right, there's this beautiful shelter with a little stream running in the front, and
Quarry Gap, two shelters with a roof over it.
That's exactly right.
So good. It's
Amazing.
such a good shelter.
I mean, I don't want anybody to think, interestingly, now I say that, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here that most people, when they've read about the AT, read about shelters thinking, oh, they're going to be gnarly and pretty unpleasant and so on. That is a beautiful work of art almost, isn't it? And they care for that. There's little notices and signs and
potted plants.
Potted plants there as well, and little places, other places to sit. Is it a matter of local pride? I mean, what are these guys doing?
I think all trail clubs are awesome, and they all put in so much for the trail. I think a lot of them they have the shelters that they've had forever. I'm sure they would love to update them as much as they could. I think it comes down to the caretakers. I think all the shelters are, they're cared for by clubs, but sometimes these shelters are cared for by the same people for a long time.
Yeah.
I write about the shelter, the Tumbling Run shelters right near there in Pennsylvania, the non-snoring and snoring.
Yes.
And this family has been taking care of that shelter since 1991.
Wow.
And they go there every day.
Do they?
Every day.
I met them then.
Yes.
I met them.
And they're
I met
the sweetest.
Yes, I met the guy. It was a guy by himself, I think. But
it's a husband and wife and a father.
Nice.
And because it's 0.2 from the road, they go there every day. And that shelter could be trashed, by people who go there and party and leave trash or don't take care of it. Not with Kurt and Tanya around.
No, they were clearing up. I tell you, they were clearing up. Yeah, and access to water is often a topic on blogs and so on. Do you think the popularity of a shelter is sometimes tied to the ease of getting water? Because you know what it's like. Sunderland, there are some massive climbs down and then massive climbs back up again, aren't there?
Yeah, there's one in Pennsylvania that's like 500 steps. There's a sign that's like, it's 500 steps down there.
That's right, yeah.
Good luck.
And there's not much water around that section as well, is there?
And there's nothing you can do about it. I think it's Peters Mountain Shelter.
That's right.
Yep. And it is.
Is it just past Peters Mountain?
It is 300 rock steps.
Yes. Nice.
300. If you could look back at the early documents of shelters and kind of the requirements of shelters, back early in the 30s, 40s, when they were trying to set these guidelines of like what an AT shelter should be, one of the most basic locations is that it should have a reliable water source.
Yes, I think
there's something to be said about that. And then, of course, now privies, but it's not like they have to have a great view. They have to have all these things. No, they have to have water. And almost all of them have water, but there are a few that just have no water.
That's right. Yes,
yeah.
I know.
Yeah, so you got to plan ahead.
So in the time you've now done this, and I'm sure you changed with your 200 section hikes, do you have a favourite?
Favorite shelter?
Yeah.
Everyone keeps asking me that. I have to say I love the old ones. There's a reason the one on the front. It might be the one on the front of cover just because it's my like hometown shelter. So I live right outside of Hot Springs. Anyone who knows the trail knows the trail town of Hot Springs. I live about 20 minutes from there, and so I run the ridge there a lot. Like when I go hike or if I'm just going to go trail run, I run up to Spring Mountain Shelter a lot. It's just really easy access, and I can just run up, tag it, run back to my car. And I just love the idea of the Civilian Conservation Corps and just like that Go America spirit when they built a lot of shelters in the 30s. I just love that it's an original structure. It sits right on the trail and has a blaze on it. Not a lot of shelters have blazes on them. If you think about it, they're off the trail. That one sits like right on the trail.
That's right.
And it's an original structure. And three of the oldest shelters in a row are actually in Madison County, or I should say like the section right near Madison County. So it's Spring Mountain Shelter and Deer Park Mountain and Walnut Mountain. And they're all old Civilian Conservation Corps shelters. There's not a lot of them left. There's like 30 CCC shelters left, and three of them in a row is where I hike every month.
Right. Well, you know,
Yeah. I just love them.
Is your daughter going hiking with you now?
Oh, yeah.
A little bit more? Is she? That's lovely.
She does, yeah. My husband carries her. She likes to hike because, you know, she's a 3-year-old, so she's stubborn, but she likes to hike the first like 2 miles, and then she wants to be carried. So, you know, we don't hike as far yet.
So the last couple of questions one's about the over mountain shelter.
Mountain.
Has that gone or is it going now?
You know, it is definitely off limits and taped up, and they're asking people to not even go inside. You know, it's structurally unsound. It was not meant to be a shelter. It's a barn that became a shelter.
Yeah.
So as far as I know, it's there, but off limits, and you should camp, 200 yards or whatever away from it. And if anyone's listening to this podcast, please don't ruin it for everybody else, you guys. Please. We all love it, and we want it to be there, so respect it.
That one did have the best view from a privy of anyone on any privy on the trail.
Yes.
Really, yes, you've obviously noticed that as well. Yeah, it's a pretty darn good one. Well, look, I think, there are tons of AT books out there. There's none like yours, Sarah.
Thank
and
you.
I'm so impressed you put this together. I think it's such a great addition to the AT books, and I can highly recommend it to everybody. And Sarah's kindly agreed to give one away. So we're going to work out a question, which I'm not going to ask her now because we're still going to work that out. And we're going to give copies of books away to listen, or a copy of a book to the listener who gets the questions. One from me, one's going to be from our next guest, Bruce Matson, and one's going to be from Sarah. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story about the shelters.
Thank you so much. It was an honor. And yeah, just want to say hi to the trail community that I love so much. And I hope we can all be out there together again soon.
Yeah, same here. Super. Good talk to you, eh?
All right. Good talking to you. Bye.
Bye. Wasn't that interesting? I'm not kidding you. Those pictures take you right back there and really bring the shelters to life. Yep, we know they're all infested by mice, and we know that they probably help transmit norovirus better than anywhere else. But for me, the shelters were an intrinsic part of hiking life on the AT, and I think the place would be poorer without them. I tended to camp at shelters, but it allowed me a social interaction better than anything else, so I love them. Now for the contest. Sarah kindly agreed to donate one of these great books, signed by her, and she wants to know the answer to this question. What is the largest non-hut shelter on the AT? I'll give you a bit of a clue. It's Sleep's 24. Got that? Well, keep listening, because there are 2 more questions and 5 more books to win in this contest. Just before we get on to Bruce, I wanted to thank those of you who wrote to me to tell me how much you appreciated the interview that I did with my buddy Pete last week. You know, the bloke who had COVID-19. I got some of the most touching and complimentary messages that I've had on any topic, so I appreciate your concern for Pete, and I'm delighted to be able to tell you that he went for a 2-mile walk yesterday. He was exhausted, but his breathing was fine, so thanks for reaching out. I should say that Pete is so popular back in the UK that I noticed a big spike in downloads. I normally get between 50 and 100 downloads from the UK for each episode, but last week there were over 500 from there. As I said to Pete, it just goes to show how much his mates love him. Thanks so much. Now it's Bruce Matson, or RTK. Here's Bruce. So we've got an old friend of the show this week, and since he's been back from the trail, he can't stop writing about it. He's been turning out book after book. This is Bruce Matson, or RTK. Hi, Bruce. How are you?
Hey, Steve. Great to be with you again.
Well, it's there's another new one. You've got another one called, and I'm glad it's called it, by the way, and I kind of guess it would be called Returning to Katahdin, the name of our podcast, and the one that tells about your journey. Before we get to that, though, let's first talk about the other 2. The first one was the Platinum Blazing the Appalachian Trail, and you did a sort of guide on some of the really better places to stay, and I certainly noticed a massive uptick when I went, last year, how much better places to stay were. What sort of reaction did you get to that one? Because, as you know, some people really like to rough it out there, and the concept of platinum blazing could be anathema to some of them. So did you get much pushback, or what do people think?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And we were So I came up with this idea for the book about a third of the way through my through hike, which you'll recall was in 2018.
Yeah.
Since you did talk to me a couple times a week, but
Yeah.
but I kind of got this. I just crossed my mind. And when you're in the woods all day, you have a fair bit of time to do some thinking, and kind of became the idea of everyone's going to get off the trail from time to time. And whether you get off once or 100 times, you're not going to get off every day. You're not going to stop in every town. You're not going to go to every restaurant. You're not going to go to every hostel or
Sure.
B&B. So where can I get some help to know how to best spend my time? And even if I have limited dollars, where can I do that? And it really came from an idea that I developed from the Camino. I did the Camino, which you've done, of course. I did the Camino back in 2014.
Sure.
And there was one stop along the Camino that I didn't really know much about. I went through the town, stopped for lunch, and kept going. But later on in the trip, there were 3, 4, 5 friends who said, "Hey, did you stay in Grignon? Did you do this? Did you go have this experience at Grignon?" And all of a sudden, I came to realize that, and of course, it's not that this is some big revelation. If I had done better preparation for the Camino like I did for the AT, I would have known. But I missed what I would call, my overused word, of course, iconic. I like to say things are iconic. And I missed this great stop in Grignon. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly for our Spanish friends, but and I thought to myself, and somehow in my walks along the trail, I said, I did a lot of research, and there are certain things I don't want to miss. And the obvious one to me was Woods Hole. I had read a lot about Woods Hole, and I said, I am stopping there. And in my Camino trip, it was sort of walk, 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 and happen. It kind of unfolded for me. And there's something I think certainly interesting about that too. But as you know, I'm a bit of a planner, and there were certain things I didn't want to miss. I didn't want to miss a number of the things I've heard about, like staying with Elmer in Hot Springs and stopping at Woods Hole. And we can talk about the quote unquote iconic places. So my thought was, well, there are lots of things between Georgia and Maine that I've read about from all my preparation. And there's not really a guide to tell you, you might want to consider this or you can consider that. And so I thought about the book about a third of the way through. And then I just mentioned it to other hikers and I got positive feedback. So when I got off the trail, that was the first thing I did. I started writing this. About halfway through writing the book, I realized, about half the people out there are 20 something and the other half of the people are 50, 60 something.
Yes.
And so I said, I really need somebody with a younger perspective. And I had met and befriended this guy named Sharkbait, who was in his late 20s. And I said, and he happened to live not too far from me in Northern Virginia. And lo and behold, I got him to co-author the book with me. So I thought a 20-something perspective. Plus, I knew he was a good writer because he had his own blog, and he actually, I think, writes better than I do. And so it was a good team to put together. And we put this book together to highlight. And we were very concerned about it seeming like it was arrogant or it was only for people who were wanted this luxurious experience. And
it wasn't all about price, was it? It wasn't all about it. Was the experience, wasn't it?
It wasn't actually, but we tried to make it a little tongue in cheek. Even if you look at the cover sheet, the subtitle is "How to Through Hike in 3-Star Luxury," and on the cover of the book, the word 5-star is crossed out and replaced by 3-star. So it's a long answer to your simple question, but I was really worried about the purists and the people who, want to tough it out, being heavily critical of this idea of hiking in luxury. But thankfully, we seem to have hit a reasonably good balance.
Yeah, I think people took that you weren't taking it too seriously, and you're right. But it is a good guide, and I've certainly picked a few things up from it, and I stayed at. And Woods Hole will forever be my favourite place to stay. I'm absolutely sure about that. Now, the second one was more about the planning and managing your hike, and I know that particularly or often the emotional state of hiking wasn't always easy for you, was it? How did you set about writing that one? It says it. I think the subtitle was observations and something
suggestions. Yeah, it's I think I'm not short of opinions, and I loved my hike, and I have suggestions and ideas about how to successfully hike.
Yeah.
And so I just started collecting, like, I did a number of talks, and people would call and ask questions. And,
Sure.
I have opinions about, pack weight or
Sure. Yeah.
hiking in the winter. And I just started, partly having time and I enjoy the writing process. I just started collecting all of these miscellaneous observations
Right.
about a
Right.
thru hike. I decided to roll it into, it's a fairly short book. It's only 80, 90 pages. It talks about all kinds of things as to why you should or shouldn't do the approach trail, different things about, anything you can think of. And you've talked about on the
Mm.
show
Yeah.
about different aspects, whether it be the type of shoes to wear or where the rocks in Pennsylvania begin, just all of these miscellaneous issues that I came across that I had to deal with and how I resolved them. And the point I try to make in the intro to the book is, don't become a hater or a disagreeer. This is one person's approach and how I resolve the issues. And if
Yeah.
it works for you, it works for you. But even if you go through the analytical process I did, you might come up with a different answer, but
Mm.
you'll understand.
Yeah.
Like, the thing I didn't really, as an example, I didn't appreciate, people love trail runners out there. People love hiking and ultras. I really didn't and I ended up in a very sort of not having heavy hiking boots and not having light trail runners. I ended up in the middle. And until I finished Pennsylvania and reflected back and talked to people, I didn't really appreciate what the risk reward was for having hiking shoes have got a better midsole, and the cost that you take on for having a lightweight shoe, but also the benefit for having a lightweight shoe for the obvious reasons. And I just talk about how balance those things. And I've always thought that the key to successfully finishing a hike is resolving all of those miscellaneous issues in a way that worked best for you, not
Yes.
because I did it or you did it, but which of these compromises, and there must be 100 compromises you make as you decide on stoves and food and north south weather, as you know. So I just collected them all in a book, and then I said this is a good time of year with people off the trail to just think through, like, planning for a through hike for next year. And I decided that I'd love for people to read it. It's just a bunch of opinions, and I didn't want to make any money off it. So I put it at a fairly low price point, and every book sale revenue will go to as a contribution to the ATC.
And that was also the case with the previous one, wasn't it? The Platinum Blazing one.
Yeah, half of the proceeds of that book.
Yeah, which is very cool. Now let's turn to the new one. This is more, I suppose, traditional AT memoir type, and we covered a lot of it in our podcasts. When you were writing this book, as opposed to when we were podcasting, were you able to be a little more frank about what it was like? I only ask because I know you weren't always as much as honest in the podcast, particularly when you were having a tough time, you were struggling. Was it more to stop the family from worrying too much? And did you then, once you got into the writing process, they knew you were safe, so you could say what you liked?
Yeah, I think not that I feel like it was dishonest when you were interviewing me, but I think, and I'm not going to say it's terribly raw. There certainly are, overall, I had a very successful hike and a wonderful time. I had a lot of tough moments, and I think I cover those in a way that give people some good exposure as to the joys and the traumas of doing a through hike.
Sure. So did you enjoy the process of actually redoing it? I know that because I'm going to write, I did my 2014 book, and I'm going to do a 2019 book as well, but that's sometime later in the year because I'm doing a Camino book right now. So I've got too much going on right now, as well as the podcast, obviously. Did you enjoy reliving the journey while you were writing? And did you, because you keep quite good notes, don't you, I presume? Did you remember stuff the way in which you think you remembered it, or did things change in your mind once you started writing?
Yeah, well, there's always a little bit of impact of looking back. Perspective makes a difference for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate, and this is like an example of one of the things I put in that second book. The second book is called are you thinking about a through hike of the AT?
Yeah.
And one of the many, it's just a collection of miscellaneous ideas. And one of the ideas is journaling. And I just say in a fairly short, maybe in one paragraph, I say, I highly encourage you to journal, even if it's simply to record people, places, and things. And I did a good job of saying on Tuesday, I was at the Curly Maple Shelter, and I finished at the town of Hot Springs, and et cetera, et cetera. And as much as I love my time out there, there are plenty of days that seem to become similar to the next or the previous. And without a good journal, I would have made some mistakes, I think. And I literally had to correct some of my writing as I went back to my journal. So one, I think the journal was really critical for the accuracy. But your real question was, did I enjoy the process? And I have to say, I love the process of reliving. I literally had the AWOL guide with me, and I would be like, was that 2 miles or was that 12 miles? I could literally go back, look at my journal, think about my memory, and see in the guidebook and how I recall it. And the reliving, I really enjoy the writing process itself, whether anybody wants to read anything I have to say. But so I just love the process, but I thoroughly enjoyed reliving the trip, the friends I made, and the experiences I had, as well as the really difficult times.
Yeah, I mean, I had a blog when I did it in 2014, so I could write from the blog. I could read it and stuff. And obviously, doing my Camino book now and doing my AT book later in the year, I've been listening to my podcast. I didn't do any real journaling when I was out there, but the podcast I listened to the first couple of episodes, which I never do. I listened to the first, and that was my notes, and it just kind of worked out well. It brought me back to everything straight away. So I love I love the process of having something recorded. And I totally agree with you. Anybody who goes out there should never ever believe they're going to remember it when they get back, because you're right. Not so much it goes into one, but the real detail you get if you write it down. Or even in my case, speak it. So I think that's really important. And did it make you, when you were writing it, did it make you want to go on another long hike again or not?
That's good. Actually, I actually listened to, I think that most of your listeners know that you did a podcast on my trip 2 years ago. So I actually started listening to my whole,
oh, did
while
you?
I was writing, I just basically, when I got in the car, I would, if I wasn't listening to your weekly Thursday one, I would be listening to my own journey. So cool. That helped me refresh while I was doing the writing process too.
That is so cool. But did that make you want to go again or not?
So, that's a really good question. I don't think my experience is that different, but everyone's different. When I finished, I think anybody who listened, I was done. I was ready to be done. One thing that anybody who's interested in the memoir will really see how the length of time on the trail impacted me emotionally. And it was harder and harder to be excited every day. And I had to work harder at what I would call mental devices to keep me moving. And as you know, and some people who listened, I don't really think I would have finished the trail if I hadn't hooked up with G-Bolt and had a companion who was with me every single day for all of Maine. Now, I didn't want anything to do with having that kind of commitment early on. I wanted the freedom to be very independent. But it does show how, at least for me, and I think I have had fun with the shutdown with the virus of reliving, writing, watching some other people's AT videos, finding people from my class who posted stuff.
Sure.
And there's a lot of people, when I finished watching last night, there's a lot of people who get pretty tired of being out there and they're ready to finish. They are determined. They just want to be finished. My point is, I didn't have any interest in another hike when I finished. I knew that I would never do another long hike. I knew I'd go out weekend hiking and day hiking. But over the year and over the writing process, I've become more and more and more interested. And now I'm almost convinced I'm going to do some other long hike, whether it's 6 months on the PCT. I always said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's actually on the short list now. So I don't know if it was as much the writing process, but probably impacted it to recall the joy, the journey.
Yeah.
But I do think I really needed to get away from the experience to be ready to do it again.
That is definitely true. You have to get it in the past and you have to absorb the lessons. I think it teaches you. It taught me a lot physically and emotionally. And really, with distance, it becomes easier to think of going again. And, obviously, I've tried it a few times. I think I've got one more in me, but I'm not terribly sure what it is. And one last quick question is that now you've had more time to digest what happened to you on the AT in 2018. Do you think you prepare so assiduously for it, or would you just go with basically the notes of what you had, or would you wing it a little bit more if you went again?
Good question. I think it's, I can't strip away all the planning I did. So if I went out and I winged it, I would still be winging it with a lot of preparation in mind, as well as the actual experience in mind. But I think I know what you're asking. I think I would be a little more spontaneous. I would be both planning and spontaneous, because there are still things that, I really have to do, want to do. And doing the AT again is something that would be interesting to me. So my point is, I'd be more spontaneous, but I also would plan, because I went over match packs in a blizzard. I've heard so many wonderful things about match packs. There are places on the AT that I now want to make sure I see in the right weather at the right time. So I might even sit in town for 2 days if that's what it would take for me to experience match packs in the right conditions, if you know what I mean.
I do. I totally understand. That's what I say to people: take the views when you got them. They may not be there tomorrow. So so for me, going a second time, I saw things I didn't see first time, and vice versa. I saw things first time I didn't see second time. So I'm kind of glad in that part of it. Well, look, I hope the book does well. I've read quite a lot of it, actually. I haven't read it all, but I've read quite a lot of it. And as always, you write so really nicely, and you bring us there with you. The fact that I followed you along with you on the podcast for me helped as well. But I really wish you well with the book, and it's great talking to you again.
Yeah, let me know which parts of the book you're like, you never told me this.
I know. I will. I'm going to give you a proper review when I finish it. All right.
All right. Well, really good to catch up, and I'm having a lot of fun listening to all the podcasts. So appreciate everything you do for the hiking community, because the podcasts are always a lot of fun.
That's great. Take it easy. Bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
It's lovely to chat with Bruce again. He always apologises for long answers, but really he's a podcaster's dream. There's never a lull when Bruce and I start chatting. He too has donated a signed copy of all 3 of his books, so his question is going to be a little tougher. Ready for this? In which town do participants in the Curly Maple Pizza Challenge purchase the beer and pizza necessary to complete the challenge? Once again, it's pretty wordy. Well, think about it. Don't forget that you can always listen to every back episode of any of our podcasts on hikingradionetwork.com. They're all there, including Bruce's and Dix's hike on the AT in 2018. With everybody else giving away books, I thought that I'd add my 2 to the mix. My Appalachian Trail, Volumes 1 and 2, tell the story of my 2014 thru-hike, and if I do say so myself, they are a damn good read. You will, however, learn way more about me than you might wish to know, but it's all there, warts and all. I'll sign them as well, of course. So my question is this. I'm asking it in honour of Sarah's shelter book. What shelter has the highest elevation on the trail? So there's that one, the Curly Maple Pizza Challenge one, and the largest non-hut shelter on the trail. Email me answers to those 3 questions to steve@mightyblueontheat.com, and I'll put them all into a draw and maybe do a Facebook Live drawing to find the winner. The winner will receive all 6 books, all signed. Very exciting. Just before we get on to reading Grandma Gatewood's incredible journey, it would be remiss of me not to thank, once again, those of you who step up each week and support the show. Remember, you can donate on the mightyblueontheat.com podcast page, and every donation is so gratefully received. Now, Grandma Gatewood accidentally teaches us all a lesson that was still being slowly learned in 1955. I'll see you next week. Chapter 11. Shelter. August the 12th to the 13th, 1955. That Friday was the rainiest August day in the written history of New York City, and what was left of Hurricane Connie, which made landfall at Moorhead, North Carolina, before scraping up the Atlantic coast, had just begun its onslaught in the northeast. 10 people in the metropolis already were dead from the floods, a number that would continue to climb. Between midnight Thursday and midnight Friday, Connie dumped nearly 6 inches of rain on New York. Faced with flooding in various parts of the city, 60,000 volunteers in New York's civil defense program were on standby. The headline in the New York Times read, "Connie blows north with force equal to thousands of H-bombs." Behind the storm was a path of waterlogged destruction. In Wilmington, North Carolina, City Hall was flooded by 18 inches of water. Near Hampton Roads, Virginia, hurricane winds had slammed 2 freighters together. 70 Red Cross shelters in the Carolinas held 14,756 refugees. Much of the tobacco and corn crop had been ruined. At North Beach, Maryland, a young woman staggered out of the choppy Chesapeake Bay and collapsed on shore, and locals sounded an alarm. Wreckage from a 64-year-old schooner called 11J Marvel, which had been carrying tourists on a cruise, began to wash up. By the end of the day, a coroner had laid out 10 bodies, still wearing life preservers, at the North Beach fire station. Behind Connie, too, was another storm. In the darkness between August 11th and 12th, the season's 4th hurricane curved abruptly to the northeast and picked up speed. The intensification was so rapid that overnight the winds increased from 50 miles per hour to 125 miles per hour. The rain bands north of Connie covered virtually all of New England, dropping 8 inches of rain on Connecticut in just 2 days. To the north, the rain running off the Green Mountains and White Mountains rapidly filled brooks and streams, which began to crest their banks and picked up velocity as they flowed downhill and fed into larger creeks and rivers. 200 miles north of soaked New York City, Emma woke in a cabin in the woods, happy to have dry clothes thanks to the little fire. The Navy boys were planning on sticking around the cabin to do some fishing, so she bade them goodbye and headed down the trail in a light rain. In the daybreak, she could see that the nearby pond had swollen during the night and was pouring out over the trail. A wooden bridge across the stream was now a series of floating logs, and she got her feet wet immediately while trying to get across. She wore a plastic cape around her shoulders, but soon realized it was no use trying to stay dry. Minutes into a hike, her clothes were soaked, and the wetter her sack got, the heavier her haul. She had heard about a nice, well-kept shelter on Bromley Mountain, and for most of the hike she fantasized about getting out of the rain, drying her clothes and having a hot bite to eat. In the late afternoon, when she came into a clearing and saw the shelter, Emma stopped in her tracks and gaped. Even from the outside, it appeared to be the most down-at-heels place she could imagine. To begin with, the lodge was abandoned. The doors were off their hinges and the windows had been broken out. When she stepped inside, rain was pouring through holes in the roof. Porcupines had eaten big chunks out of the wood floors. The stove was unusable. She hung her wet clothes on an old ladder and stretched it over a fireplace. She got a fire going to dry out her things, but everything was so wet that she couldn't build enough heat. Disappointed though she was, she made the best of her surroundings. The water pouring in from a big hole in the roof made a decent stream in which she washed her clothes. Her sleep was intermittent. She couldn't keep dry in bed that night due to the leaks. In July 1939, P.C. Gatewood sold his second farm and announced to his family that they were moving to Barker's Ridge, West Virginia, where he had bought an even smaller patch of land on which he hoped to grow tobacco. The farm was in disrepair and the fences needed work, but a log cabin sat on the property and there was room for a few sheep. Emma did not want to leave Ohio, but there was no use in fighting, so they packed their things into the truck and moved across the river, 18 miles east of Huntington. She cried quietly the whole way. The 3 children still living at home, Nelson, 15, Louise, 13, and Lucy, 11, enrolled in school, and Emma got a job as a government monitor, her role to make certain no farmer planted more tobacco than he was allowed. She tried to make the best of her new life. She braided rugs and planted vegetables and found time to write poetry, rhymes that seemed to be longing for a better situation. She mailed back one untitled poem to a home newspaper in Gallipolis, which published it. A home is made of many things, books and papers and little strings, a comb and brush to fix one's hair, a mending basket and easy chair, a clock, some music, the sacred book, a kitchen stove and food to cook. The sound of little feet about, up the stairs and in and out, little trinkets on the floor, trains and cars and dolls galore. Children's clothes and children's beds, a kitty cat that must be fed, a dog to warn us with his bark when someone bothers when it's dark, a mother that is kind and good and patient with her little brood. A great big place must father fill, besides the paying of the bills. A spirit there that brings together in every trial and kind of weather. There must be kindness every day if it's a home with shining ray. PC burned a mountain field and planted a small crop. Each Saturday morning PC would leave with arms to Kingery and would not return until Sunday evening. His wife never asked him where he had been because she did not care. It was on Sunday in early September 1939 that Emma Gatewood received her last beating at the hands of her husband. It was then that her endurance of his cruelty ended. The details can't be found in the various biographical sketches that accompanied the honours bestowed upon her in later years. They're not found in any newspaper article or magazine story about her either, and there are hundreds. In fact, the woman who did not smoke or drink or curse would tell newspaper reporters she was a widow for years to come, even if P.C. Gatewood was alive and well in Ohio. The details of this dark time were kept by her family, and they did not speak often of it for many years. That September day, P.C. and Emma got into an argument that developed into their final fight. No one remembers what subject prompted the disagreement, and there is naturally some confusion about the order of events. What is known is that Nelson, 15, found his father assaulting his mother inside the home. He had beaten her in the face, which was swollen and bruised. Her upper and lower teeth were broken. Her left ear was black, and a mole above her ear was ripped nearly off. One of her ribs was cracked. Nelson, who had always been small for his age but was nearing 150 pounds of bone and muscle, grabbed his father, pinning PC's arms to his sides, and lifted him off the floor. He told his mother to run, and she did, out of the front door and into the woods. Nelson held his father for a few more seconds, then released him, and PC ran in pursuit of his wife. When he couldn't find her, he returned and walked past Nelson to the stove, where he picked up an iron poker and raised it over his head. "Make your first swing a good one," Nelson told his father. "You're only going to get one." The old man didn't swing. PC left that day, and Emma returned to the house in his absence. When he came back later, he was trialed by a deputy sheriff or justice of the peace. Some family members believe that PC's friend, Armster Kingery, who held political clout in the region, pulled some strings to have Emma arrested. Whatever the case, PC parked his truck, climbed out and walked purposefully toward the house, the lawman tagging behind. When he jerked open the front door, his wife was waiting with a 5-pound sack of flour, which she heaved in his direction. The flour connected squarely with her husband's face and exploded into a cloud of white. The 4 witnesses disagree about minor details, such as whether the flour incident occurred in the presence of the officer or preceded his arrival, but they collectively recall that Lucy and Louise were in a state of consternation. As the lawman walked their mother to his car, Louise ran inside to fetch her pocketbook. Lucy clung to her mother until the officer pulled her away. The deputy placed Emma into his car and drove her to the neighbouring town of Milton, West Virginia, where she was booked on unknown charges and locked inside a jail cell. She had held her own, come what may. Her shoes were wet. Her socks were wet. Her dungarees were wet. Her shirt was wet. Her sack was wet. When she left the Bromley shelter early the morning of August the 13th, rain was still falling. Hurricane Connie had dumped record amounts of water on its course along the coast, the giant outer bands of its counterclockwise rotation dragging water from the Atlantic onto the land, and now it was moving toward the Great Lakes region. At 10 a.m. the storm crossed the southeastern border of Pennsylvania, sideswiping New England and slashing a diagonal track across the Keystone State, the calm eye passing Harrisburg, over Pittsburgh and slightly northeast of Erie, before moving over Lake Erie and toward Toronto in Canada. The winds had slowed to 55 miles per hour, and weathermen had begun referring to Connie as a storm rather than a hurricane. Still, the rain came. In 2 days, the storm had dumped more than 9 inches of rain on New York City, bringing train traffic at Grand Central Terminal to a halt for hours. Much of Connecticut got 8 inches. Power and telephone service was out for many in the region. The northern Appalachian Mountains, the Whites, Greens, Taconics and Alleghenies were all saturated, and the streams were running wild, sending incredible amounts of water rushing down into the Schuylkill and Delaware rivers in Pennsylvania, the Delaware and Ramapo rivers in New Jersey, the Delaware and Neversink rivers in New York, the Potomac River in Virginia and Maryland, the Westfield River in Massachusetts, and the Naugatuck and Mad Rivers in Connecticut. Many of them were close to the flood stage, and there was another erratic storm a few days behind and headed north. On the Appalachian Trail through Green Mountain National Forest, Emma was not walking so much as wading, and atop the ridges the wind, remnants of the hurricane, was blowing strong. She steeled herself against the elements and trudged onward. For 9 miles she sloshed through water, strong winds and driving rain. She ducked out of the deluge at a little shelter near Mad Tom Notch and had a soggy lunch from a sack. She hiked on through the afternoon at a much slower pace than she would have liked until she came to another shelter at Griffith Lake, a small pond near Peru Peak. The shelter was occupied by a group of young black men and 2 slightly older white leaders from a Roman Catholic parish in Harlem. The men explained that they had come up for a wilderness trip and had found themselves stuck inside because of the storm. Emma enjoyed their company, though she was surprised to see them on the trail. She read the newspapers every day, so she was well aware of the tension between the races in 1955, when 1 in 10 US citizens was black. The previous May, the Supreme Court had outlawed separation of the races in public schools and launched a period of protest. It would be 4 months before the name Rosa Parks would enter the national conversation, but sparks of rebellion had begun to flare all over America as the federal government started to act in favour of equality. The Federal Trade Commission ruled that segregation in depot waiting rooms and on trains engaged in interstate transportation was illegal. A federal appeals court in Georgia, where the former governor wrote that God advocates segregation, demanded Atlanta open its public golf courses to black golfers. A court in Richmond, Virginia, barred segregation on city buses. In many places, the advancements implemented by the government strengthened the resolve of whites to maintain the upper hand. In South Carolina, a Negro Little League baseball team won its way to the state championship, then found that 55 competing white teams had withdrawn. In Arkansas, a Baptist congregation fired a pastor who preached against segregation. In Miami, a group of politically prominent African Americans was thrown out of a hotel after it arrived, by invitation, to an Abraham Lincoln birthday dinner held by local Republicans. And white citizens' councils, a less secretive and less violent version of the Ku Klux Klan, sprouted across the South to put political and social pressure on blacks who tried to assert their new rights. Emma talked to the young men a while, telling them of her trip, and decided to press on since the night would have made the 8 by 20-foot shelter a little too crowded. She walked down an embankment and came to a rushing creek near Little Mond Pond. She couldn't cross there, so she hiked up into the woods until she found a log stretched across the flowing water. She balanced carefully and made it across without falling. She walked down the trail a bit more and found that a flooded brook had joined the trail at a flat, narrow stretch. The water was running a mill race straight down the path. She stepped into the flow, but the water came all the way to her knee on the very first step, so she backed out. The shelter with a group from Harlem would have to do. Emma came from a place that was nearly all white and completely segregated, but she did not discriminate. She taught her children to respect others, no matter their skin colour or stage in life. She would not allow them to utter racial epithets and taught them to treat people as they wished to be treated themselves. One experience on the trail defined this attitude. An African-American couple invited her to dinner, and when she was seated and served, they withdrew. She refused to eat unless they joined her, and she seemed embarrassed by their treatment. Emma found the boys baking 2 pones of cornbread. They had fashioned a little stove and were cooking over hot ashes from a fire. When they finished, they ate 1 cake and saved the other to eat on the trail the next day. When it was time for bed, Emma squeezed herself into one corner and ducked under her blanket as the rain plinked off the roof. Before she dozed off, the young man next to her, apparently asleep, slung his arm across her body. She moved his limp appendage back. He did it again. She moved it back. He did it again. 6 days before, the Reverend G.W. Lee, a respected minister and local official of the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, was killed by an unknown assailant in Belzoni, Mississippi. 7 days later, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Chicago boy visiting family in Money, Mississippi, would be kidnapped and murdered and dumped in the Tallahatchie River after he allegedly whistled at a white woman. That very same day, August 13, a black man named Lamar Smith was shot to death in broad daylight within sight of the courthouse in Brookhaven, Mississippi, and police wouldn't be able to find a single witness to testify against the white men charged in his death. And on the Appalachian Trail, inside a crowded little shelter in the Green Mountains of Vermont, an old white woman fell asleep under the arm of a young black man from Harlem.